Let us listen to the Word of God as written in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. The destruction of the temple foretold. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" And then Jesus said to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. For nation there will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." The word of the Lord. Good morning. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I would like to thank Reverend Mason and the worship committee for the invitation to the opportunity to speak with you, but I have to say that it's very weird to be up here and have Reverend Mason in the congregation. So usually when I'm here, he's on vacation. So if you listen carefully to our reading today and follow the news the past few days, things are pretty scary in the world right now. The terror attacks in France, the bombing of the jetliner in Egypt, are just the latest stories that make it seem as though the apocalypse might be upon us. And this is what Jesus is addressing in the gospel lesson this morning, the end of things as we know them. And while apocalyptic events have existed for at least 2,000 years, there certainly wasn't the immediacy of press coverage like there is today. The flood of Noah, the Black Death of the Middle Ages, the volcanic explosion that destroyed Pompeii, these and other natural disasters all made people think of the apocalypse. Now, apocalyptic scenarios also play out all over television. My oldest son, I'll get the words out, my oldest son tells me that I'm missing out on the best show on television if I don't watch The Walking Dead. My response is, "I'm sorry, Chris, but that's just not my cup of tea." But Jesus uses some pretty strong language here. And I quote from the Message, "As he walked away from the temple, one of his disciples said, 'Teacher, look at the stonework, look at those buildings.' And Jesus said, 'Are you impressed by this grandiose architecture? There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble.'" So we have to remember that Mark's audience, the thought of the apocalypse was very real. No one knew what caused a thunderstorm. No one knew what caused an earthquake. Their knowledge of the workings of nature and the world around them was minimal. So when someone talked about the world coming to an end, they didn't say, as we would say today, "Really?" They asked, "When?" So does all this violence and tragedy mean that the end is coming now? And Jesus said this is routine history. This is not a sign of the end. And what we're hearing from Jesus here is part of his final discourse before he goes to his death on the cross. And we know that then comes the resurrection, a rebirth. Jesus says, no, this isn't the end. There is hope for new life. And there's hope for new life here at Union, too, which is what I want to talk about this morning. Jesus said to his disciples, "You're impressed by this grandiose architecture? There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble." And I want us to think of Jesus' comments as they relate, as though they were addressed to us here today. You're impressed by this grandiose architecture, this unique building that we call Union Church? There's not a stone in the whole works that is not going to end up in a heap of rubble. So there's two main points that I want to discuss with you this morning, and both are designed, I hope, to force you to think about the church, not just where we are today, but more importantly, where we're going. Union Church, like all churches, is a community of faith. Union is community collectively, those sitting here in the congregation today that worship in this building. We are the church. The building is not the church. We are the church. So the first point that I want to make today is, what will Union Church look like in a couple of years when Reverend Mason retires? What will Union Church look like in 5 years, in 10 years? Reverend Mason will be retiring, and we need to start looking beyond his ministry with us. What will we look like to future potential ministers? The presbytery set salary limits for full-time and part-time pastors. Will we be able to afford a full-time pastor in a couple of years? Will we be seen as a growing, thriving congregation? Or will we be seen as a shrinking, struggling congregation? My second point has to do with finances. Excuse me. In 1989, the session of this church wisely set a floor or a minimum amount for our endowment. They voted that the session would have to approve any withdrawal from the endowment that would bring the level below that amount. Now, this summer I got a call from Richard Smith, the church treasurer, that we had withdrawn funds to cover expenses in early July, and we actually hit that minimum number. In 1989, that number was $189,000. And adjusted for inflation in 2015, that number was $270,000. And what Richard was telling me is that he and Jolie could no longer access the endowment to cover expenses without session approval. So the Finance Committee met, and we took a look at income and expenses for July and August, which are always the lowest months of income for the church, and asked session to approve a withdrawal that would cover expenses into September, when weekly cash flow starts to pick up again. And I'm not going to go into a detailed financial report. The session is certainly happy to share all or any of that information with any and each of you. But the bottom line is that Union is operating at this point in time with an unsustainable deficit. By the time this fiscal year is over, we will have withdrawn over $60,000 from the endowment, and the value of the endowment will have dropped from $306,000 last December 31st to $249,000 at the end of October. So at our current level of expenditure, we have approximately 3, maybe 4 years left before there will be no endowment. All of this is and should be scary news. So how did we get to this point, and why are we sharing this information with you? Session has cut expenses in each of the last 6 years, and there's very little left to cut except positions and salaries. So the solution to this equation has to come from the income side of the balance sheet. Now, some of you are probably wondering why you haven't received a stewardship commitment mailing any material yet this year. Maybe you hoped that it wasn't coming. And I take full responsibility for the delay, but partly it was intentional because of changes that we're looking to make. So sometime during the next week, you will receive your stewardship packet, and there will be 4 items in it: a letter, a frequently asked questions sheet, which is new, an estimate of giving card, and a narrative budget, which breaks down our expenses by ministry category. And I beseech you to read all of this material very carefully. And the letter will explain that we're doing some things very differently this year than we have in years past. Your pledge card is now called an estimate of giving card. and it will have a different look. There will no longer be a separate pledge for benevolence. We will no longer be asking for a separate donation to support local and worldwide mission projects. Instead, Session has agreed to include benevolence into the general budget. And following good scriptural practices, 10% of the general budget will be dedicated to mission giving. So we intend to start practicing what we preach. We want to be known as the church that puts others before ourselves, as Jesus would have us do. Session will also be proposing a 2016 budget that matches 2015 spending levels for approval at the January meeting. The budget is already a bare-bones budget, and the only real place to make additional cuts is in personnel and salaries. And rather than make those cuts now, Session has agreed to continue spending at the current level at least through the end of the church year in June. Session will start to re-examine the budget in April, and if income does not increase to a point where we can sustain our spending, then we will be proposing cuts, and the congregation will be asked to vote on a new revised budget in June. Now, before any of you here today, including our visitors, think that I'm predicting an apocalypse for Union Church, let me say this as clearly and as emphatically as I possibly can. Union Church will survive. And Union Church, the family, the community of faith, does not need your money to survive. Union Church, like all communities, like churches, is a community of faith, as I said before. And while we worship in this building is not our church. We are the church. And this community of believers will continue to exist as long as each of us is alive. What might be different is where and how we worship. But this congregation, in some way, in some shape, in some size, in some form, will continue to exist. But Union Church does need your support to continue its current ministries. We need to start focusing on what is right and good about this church, this community of faith, and focus on the impact that we are having on the lives of the people who worship here, who attend our Sunday schools, who share our fellowship, and on the people in our community that depend upon us for sustenance and support, such as the people that access our food pantry. We need to start focusing on what is right and good and stop complaining about what we don't like. Last week, for those who were privileged to be here, Jim Albert shared a wonderful message using 4 words as the theme of his message, and I saw on the screens this morning that there's copies of his message on the table outside. I believe it's also on the church's website, so you can view the video on the church's website. In Jim's message, 4 words to consider talked about compassion, compromise, communication, and commitment. And I'm not going to reprise his sermon. As I said, you can watch the video or read it, but it is worth taking a look at. Now, I don't know Jim as well as many of you probably do. He's been here for 42 years. I've been here for 7. But I believe that the 4 words that Jim talked about are not just talk. From what I've seen, Jim walks the walk, and he lives those words every day of his life. And he concluded his sermon by asking some questions, and I take these directly from the copy that he sent me last week. I quote, "At Union, haven't you received and been offered compassion in some way? And at Union, haven't you been involved in compromise in some way? And at Union, haven't we all communicated in our own way with God and each other? And at Union, as a church family, haven't we all committed to support others, to support one another, and to support the church?" Now, for those of you who read the newsletter, today was listed as Commitment Sunday. It It was planned as Commitment Sunday, but I would like to refer to today as Recommitment Sunday. A new commitment on the part of all of us who belong to and relish this community of faith and the ministries that it supports. There was a column in the New York Times Magazine last week titled, "How much money should I spend to save my dog?" And it related to a person who was spending a lot of money on a dog that had cancer. I move around too much. But it was related to a person who was spending a lot of time and money on a dog that had cancer, and the conversation ended up getting around to end-of-life care. But when I saw the title, I thought, what a great title for today's sermon. How much money should I spend to save my church? So let me ask you again, what do you want Union Church to look like in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years? How much money should I spend to save my church? Will we be seen as a growing, thriving congregation? Will we be seen as God's light in this community? Will we be able to attract a leader who will help us with the growth of our ministries and our fellowship? Or will we be seen as a shrinking, struggling congregation and have a challenging time finding someone who is willing to walk with us as we are forced to extinguish God's light in this place? Harsh words, perhaps, and potentially harsh actions, but we have the opportunity to change this paradigm, to recommit, to make a new commitment to this family of faith and all that depend upon it. And only we, with God's help, can change the path that we are traveling down. To the glory of God, amen.